Good morning and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Here to give you a little late review of Newcastle 5, Aston Villa 1. As yesterday I was at Bramall Lane watching Sheffield United against Crystal Palace, and both teams looked really quite poor, or well, one team looked particularly poor in Sheffield United. Crystal Palace looked a little better, but I don't think either of those two are going to be threatening at the top, which you can't say for Newcastle because they looked absolutely fantastic, as we are all aware. It was always going to be a difficult game on paper against an Aston Villa side who you expect to be in the same race as Newcastle for that top four, possibly top five, probably top five for the Champions League this season. But in the end, it didn't turn out to be that way because Newcastle just completely overpowered Villa, particularly in the second half, and just looked really like they picked up from where they left off last season. We've spoken about pre-season, we've seen in the States and back here since at the Cellar Cup, Newcastle have looked really intense, they've looked really at it, and it's really been a positive few weeks for Eddie Howe's side. So the confidence was high going into the game, and there was no real expectation that they wouldn't turn up. But I think Newcastle probably expected a little bit more from Aston Villa. In fairness, for large swathes of that first half, it was kind of in the balance. I've watched it back, and there were some moments where you kind of looked at it and thought Villa could strike all results were kind of active and live in the game, and the thought that I had when I saw this, I came out of the press conference and it was 2-1 at the time. Alexander Isak had just put Newcastle back in front, and I looked at it and thought that's a narrative overload really, because Sandro Tonali had scored. Obviously, it was a surprise to see him start the game, given that Eddie Howe's made a big point of always embedding his team in, but when he spoke after the game, it was between him and Sean Longstaff, and fitness was the difference between them. Obviously, Sean Longstaff only came back last week in the Cellar Cup and looked good, but not quite ready. I think that's really quite harsh on Elliot Anderson, who was really the star of the pre-season, if I'm honest. But you can't really argue, given that Sandro Tonali took 6 minutes to score his first goal, and it was a really good goal as well. It was a sort of Gary Speed, Frank Lampard late arrival into the box, really good ball in from Anthony Gordon, and there you go. As I say, there was a lot in that game that said that Villa could, that showed what Villa can do, and narrative overload is the word, because Moussa Diaby then equalises with having got space in the box on the left, and he wasn't tracked, and then on the counter attack, himself and Watkins really sort of put the pay to that lack of pace that Newcastle have at the back. It just didn't sort of pay off in the end, and I think for Villa, it's kind of similar to where Newcastle were in April after that game at Villa Park, where you look at it and think it's just a really bad day at the office. Nothing really disastrous is going to come from it, I don't think. I think this is going to be one of those games where that Unai Emery takes a lot of lessons, and they didn't do things right. Their high line was pretty poor. Tyrone Mings' injury is unfortunate. I think that really sort of made a huge difference for them, but I don't see them falling away and not being on Newcastle's level. I think they'll be in that sort of top 6, top 7. I think it's going to be that big of a challenge for everyone in that race for the Champions League. I think Villa are going to be right in there, despite what happened. A lot of people were unhappy that Emi Martinez wasn't sent off for that incident yesterday with the foul on Miguel Almiron, but I think, to be honest, for me it was a yellow card. I couldn't see that he wasn't the last man, which is there was cover in the middle, but also it was too wide for it to be a goal scoring opportunity, in my opinion. So I don't think that was the wrong decision, despite what a lot of people seem to think. A really sort of great start for Newcastle. That ferocity was there. It was like they picked up from where they left off last season. In fact, it actually looks like they've improved on it. But the point I really want to look at first of all is the difference between this season and last season. I mentioned it in the Cellar Cup video last week, and also and previously on Twitter and stuff. I think the what Newcastle have learned and what Newcastle have gained in Sandro Tonali is not a number 6, as proven by his goal, but it's the ability now to have the double up of what Bruno Guimaraes can offer in midfield, and that was so evident particularly in the first half. If you look back to the game at Villa Park in April, when Newcastle lost 3-0 and were overrun from the very first minute, which is Villa did what Newcastle tend to do to teams, where they overpower them and can't let them get out. What Villa did that day was they brought Bruno out into advanced positions to beat the press, and then there was nobody there was nobody in those positions then, and Villa could break with Jacob Ramsey and break with Ollie Watkins. It happened a few times in the first half yesterday, but it was nowhere near as effective. It was more in the out wide positions where there's that lack of pace, and obviously Diaby is going to have an impact because he's such a direct player and such a good player as well. But I thought really what told for me was the fact that you have Sandro Tonali and Bruno Guimaraes working in tandem. You've got that same ability to press and go high in the positions. With was mainly Tonali on Saturday, and then Bruno can sit and control the press from a bit deeper, and that game and the organisation in midfield was much more structured than it was back at Villa Park, and that was where Newcastle got the foothold in the game and went on to win it. I think then you look at Anthony Gordon was really good. Almiron again was really good. The structure of the team is fantastic, and then you've got Isak up front, who's going to cause anybody problems this season. He looks like one of the most elite strikers in the league. He looks like he could easily get 20 goals this season in the league, and that would be the first time in 20 years since Alan Shearer did it. So that's a really, really positive start, and but we're getting used to this. The thing about this Newcastle team is that they put teams to the sword. In the second half, Villa faded it a lot, and after really the Mings injury, I think Alan Shearer talked about it on Match of the Day, and it really made the difference. That their heads dropped. They didn't recover. Pau Torres and Diego Carlos looked lost with a high line. They couldn't handle Isak. They couldn't handle Gordon, and then obviously Harvey Barnes and Callum Wilson later on in the game as well. So there was a lot to really enjoy about that performance. But it's a great start, and it shows that Newcastle have grown. What you get from Newcastle is that ability to kill teams off later in games, and you've seen it against Brentford last season, Villa last season at home, West Ham away, Tottenham obviously early on. That was a slightly different game where it was more the first 20 minutes where they just blew Tottenham away and sort of used their issues against them that day. But Newcastle have found an ability to kill teams off. If you think back to sort of the days of old under Steve Bruce or even Rafa Benitez and other managers in the Mike Ashley years, if Newcastle were 2-1 up in a game, they would be nervous. There would be an edge to them, and the ground would be swilled in this sort of fear of losing that lead, and that would ultimately consume Newcastle. Whereas now the level goes up, and now Newcastle go up, and they pounce on the little bits and they make it pay. And I think everybody is driving in the same direction. But as I say, the key thing for me is the midfield is now so much better. Because you have that ability to control the game in both phases of the midfield, the deeper and the more advanced, it allows Newcastle to be as effective in both positions, and it stops teams from beating that press. I don't think teams are going to come to St James's Park and play as high a line as Villa did, and that ultimately comes down to Unai Emery's sort of error, and I think that was a poor mistake from his part. But he wanted to impose himself on the game. I think it's very similar. The thing about these teams is that in many ways they are sort of. I think Newcastle are a better team than Aston Villa, but Aston Villa are a very good side. They want to attack teams, and when they go, they're not going to want to sit back. But Newcastle are so good at home and so effective in that way of playing in those games that I think it's very difficult to stop them, especially when you sort of invite them on. There's just so much about Newcastle to get excited about. That ferocity, that ability to attack games, and it was telling that Eddie Howe was talking about dreaming and wanting the club to push on. And I think for somebody as conservative as he tends to be with his press conferences and his interviews, that says quite a lot about how good that performance was yesterday. Tonali was the star, but I think it's really what he brings to the team. It was a surprise to see him start, I will admit, and ultimately is very harsh on Elliot Anderson not to get his start, but Eddie Howe earned his corn yesterday with that decision, and it ultimately paid off. And I think Newcastle will go forward from this in really, really high spirits. I think they're going to attack this really difficult start, and then the fixtures get a bit easier on paper as well, so Newcastle can get some momentum if they can get through the next two games. I think Liverpool will fear coming to St James's Park in the same way that many clubs have feared going to Anfield over the years. So no, it's an absolute excellent start to the season. Tonali was the difference for me. I think that was a really, really smart choice from Eddie Howe, given the situation, but also just the way Newcastle can now dominate that midfield in both phases is going to be really, really good going forward. Thanks very much for joining me. If you like what you hear, please like, share and subscribe again, and I'll catch you next time.